Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some truly fascinating source material based on a first-century letter found in Philippians chapter 1. We're taking a deep dive into this incredibly radical concept of finding indestructible joy. Even in the absolute darkest of circumstances. And to really set the stage for this, the source kicks things off with a pretty gripping piece of ancient history.
Section 1. An unbreakable Christian identity. To wrap our heads around this, let's start with the story of Perpetua. Picture this. The year is AD 200, in the deeply Roman city of Carthage. Perpetua was a pretty rare figure in the ancient world. She was a highly educated, literate woman who also happened to be a Christian, which, as you probably know, was entirely illegal at the time. Naturally, she was rounded up and arrested by the authorities. While she's sitting there awaiting her fate, her father comes to her, desperately begging her to just renounce her faith. He wants to save her life, obviously, but also their family's honor, in a culture where honor was literally everything. But Perpetua uses this brilliant kind of mic drop analogy to explain her core identity. She points to a simple water pot sitting in the room and asks her father if it could be called by any other name than what it is, a vase. When he says no, she tells them that in the exact same way, she cannot be called anything other than what she is, a Christian.
She flat out refused to back down, and tragically, she was ultimately martyred by lions in the Carthage arena. It's an undeniably brutal end, but her identity? It remained entirely unbroken. Her joy and her sense of self were completely detached from her immediate physical safety. And honestly, this ancient historical account perfectly sets the stage for the Apostle Paul's similarly radical mindset. Which brings us to Section 2, the paradox of chains. So Paul is currently imprisoned in Rome, separated from the churches he absolutely loves, and awaiting a completely unknown, likely grim fate. Normally, you'd expect a letter written from a dark prison cell to start with, well, despair. But instead, the source highlights this massive juxtaposition. Look, from a worldly perspective, being thrown in prison is a total setback, right? The mission is officially dead in the water, and Paul has been brought incredibly low. But that is not Paul's view at all. Paul completely reframes his prison cell as a strategic, bustling missionary outpost. Against all logic, he declares that the gospel is actually advancing, and in a very strange way, he's actually been elevated to the center of power. And here is why that wild reframing actually makes perfect sense. The Imperial Guard, or the Praetorian Guard, were the absolute elite of Rome. We're talking the emperor's personal bodyguards, immense influence makers, who are essentially the political kingmakers of the empire. By what the source describes as God's providence, Paul was chained daily to these exact guards. So to the outside world, he was locked up. But to Paul, he was just granted exclusive daily access to Rome's absolute VIPs, people who otherwise would have been completely unreachable. It's brilliant. And that leads us right into Section 3, reframing our circumstances. This is all about shifting our perspective on where and how we find our purpose. The source material points out that we today often play what's called the bargaining game. We look at our limitations and we basically tell God that we'll fulfill our purpose, right after our circumstances improve. It's that internal monologue we've all had. If I just had a better job, or maybe a bigger house with better interest rates, or man, if I finally got that promotion, well then I could really share my faith and do what I'm supposed to do. We constantly want the environment to be totally perfect first. Piercing straight through that worldly logic, the source asks a very direct and honestly a pretty challenging question. Do you see your circumstances as an opportunity, or do you wait for your circumstances to change? You see, Paul didn't wait for his freedom to advance his mission. He didn't sit there saying, God, break me out of here and then I'll get back to preaching. No, he looked at the literal heavy chains on his wrists and just saw a captive audience. Let's move on to Section 4, suffering as a catalyst. This touches on the highly countercultural idea of actually encouraging others through your own pain. The source material grounds this in a core theology of sovereignty, pointing to several foundational scriptures. The main idea here is that God is completely in control, which means that a believer's suffering isn't just some random bad luck or bad karma. It's governed by a much deeper providence. The message across all these verses is that even the most painful realities can be utilized for a greater purpose. So the crucial takeaway here is that Christians don't necessarily get a free pass. They don't suffer less than anyone else. But the source argues their suffering simply belongs to a God who wastes absolutely nothing. Think about it. When coworkers or neighbors or fellow believers watch someone endure real, gut-wrenching hardship with an unbroken faith, it doesn't just help that one individual. It radically emboldens the entire community. The suffering literally becomes a catalyst for other people's courage. And this brings us to our final lesson in Section 5, Finding Indestructible Joy.
This is where we uncover where true joy actually originates. While Paul was locked away in the dark, he got some pretty frustrating news. Rival preachers on the outside were actually using his imprisonment as an opportunity to build up their own platforms. They were operating out of sheer envy, selfish ambition, and complete insincerity, actively trying to afflict Paul and tear down his reputation just to elevate their own.
Now, let's be real. If most of us heard that people were using our downfall to build their own brand, we would be furious. If I were Paul, I'd probably be trying to fire off first-century tweets to defend my honor. But instead, Paul shockingly writes this: "What then? Only that in every way Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice." He completely ignores his ego. He rejoices simply because the core message is spreading, which proves that his joy is tied entirely to the mission, and not to himself.
We're looking at a stark contrast here between false joy and true, indestructible joy. False joy is super fragile. It's rooted in your personal reputation and totally dependent on your circumstances being comfortable. But indestructible joy, it's completely independent of whatever worldly situation you're in. The core argument here is that when your identity is firmly planted in something completely unchangeable, well, no rival, no prison, and literally no circumstance can ever steal it from you.
And just to prove what this isn't some sort of toxic positivity or blind optimism, the source anchors this entire theology in the foundational historical narrative of the Christian faith itself, the cross. On Good Friday, you have betrayal and the apparent total, crushing defeat of the Messiah. But 3 days later, that ultimate defeat is transformed into the greatest victory. The underlying logic is so powerful. If God can bring the absolute greatest good out of the worst evil in human history, he can for sure redeem a Roman prison cell.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We want to leave you with this final, genuinely provocative thought from the source material. What is your life actually organized around? If historical defeats can be reframed into epic victories, and if literal Roman chains can be used as tools for advancement, how might your current imperfect circumstances be used for a greater purpose right now? It's a wildly powerful framework for resilience, and it's absolutely something worth chewing on. Thanks so much for joining us.